Well, Australian security agencies are on alert for signs of local violence linked to the conflict in the Middle East after 2 Australians were killed in Lebanon, one of whom was fighting for Hezbollah. The government says it's working closely with intelligence agencies to mitigate risks. I personally have no faith in Andrew Giles' ability to handle this properly. Speaking to The Australian, the acting Home Affairs Minister said, "Social cohesion is our most valuable national asset. Our government is working with our intelligence agencies to ensure that violence overseas does not precipitate violence in Australia." Let's bring in Strategic Analysis Australia Director Michael Shoebridge. Michael, I agree that social cohesion is our most valuable national asset, but for this government to say that, we've watched this government bungle our social cohesion time and time again, haven't we?
Well, James, yes, the Voice referendum was an appalling failure of leadership from the Prime Minister that did nothing but drive social division. And some of the confused messages out of different government ministers on the Israel-Hamas war have added to that problem. My view is social cohesion is a huge asset to Australia, but that's enabled by ensuring that every Australian acts in accordance with our laws. So if you've got people protesting, shouting from the river to the sea, which is saying Israel has no right to exist, Israelis should be exterminated, they're committing an offence and they should be prosecuted under Australian law. To let that happen and do nothing enables violence domestically. It doesn't stop it.
Well, you're quite right when you mentioned the Voice. That did nothing to help social cohesion. You insinuate, quite rightly, that the government have not done much to stop anti-Semitism. And then recently, the boss of ASIO defended pro-Palestinian marches happening every week on the basis that it was an opportunity to let off steam. Otherwise, we might end up with some sort of terror attack in Australia. I would have thought those marches are more likely to further radicalise people rather than calm people down. What did you think of those comments?
I think he's made a mistake, a wrong judgment, because so often we see at these protests people that clearly support what Hamas did. And when they chant slogans like "from the river to the sea," that is really just mainlining the Hamas terrorist organization's charter, which is about exterminating Israelis and exterminating the state of Israel. This idea that we're letting pressure bleed off by enabling violence-promoting protests is a grave mistake.
Just before we move on, because I want to get to an Israeli hostage who's just given an interview about her time in Gaza, but I wanted to ask you, how serious is the threat of things escalating domestically because of what's happening overseas? Because we're getting mixed messages from security agencies, I think. You know, they're saying the marches are a good thing. On the other hand, we've now got an Australian in Lebanon fighting with Hezbollah that we're not sure whether the government were aware of that or not. How concerned should Australians be?
I think we should be concerned enough that we should want to see some arrests and some prosecutions for people that are enabling terrorist organisations like Hezbollah, where an Australian who's been killed in Lebanon has been celebrated by Hezbollah as being a member. Whether his family say the same, I don't know, but Hezbollah think he was a fighter with them. So anyone that's supporting that terrorist organisation is committing an offence under Australian law. They should be prosecuted for that. The public should know that's happening. That should deter others from just blithely supporting terrorism. And the same for Hamas. It took a long time to get Hamas officially listed in Australia as a terrorist organisation. Now anyone who is funding, supporting or working with Hamas in Australia should be prosecuted for it. That's the kind of message that the government needs to send, not some kind of kumbaya chanting thing about these protests are a good. They're not a good. They're enabling and supporting terrorist violence.
A released Israeli hostage, Mia Shem, has given an interview describing her 55 days being held captive in Gaza. The 21-year-old was snatched by Hamas terrorists from the Supernova Music Festival on October 7. So she's gone on Israeli television describing being attacked, molested, kidnapped into Gaza, threatened, held hostage by a civilian family before she was released as part of a ceasefire deal last month. I want to play you just a short clip and get your reaction.
בחלק העליון של הגוף. ואז משום מקום מישהו משם משך אותי בשיער, הכניס אותי לרכב ונסע לעזה. כמו חיה שם בספארי.
Now, she says that she was held hostage by a Gazan family, and where she was held hostage, she had women and children around. Is that surprising to you? She says that it's like one big family there, Gazans and Hamas. It's all intertwined.
Well, James, I don't think there's any doubt that Hamas has fairly strong support with a large group of the Palestinian population in Gaza. Some of them will have been pushed to be closer supporters of Hamas because of the war. But really, to think that Hamas are anything but a murderous, brutal terrorist outfit, when you hear stories like we're hearing from this Israeli woman, and you see investigative reports, as has happened around the rapes and horrible brutalization of women that Hamas committed on the 7th of October, the reality of this war and the horror that the Israelis are facing really needs to be weighed in the scales much more than we hear about it in Australia, where it's like helpless Palestinians who are innocents in this. Well, some of these Palestinians are Hamas terrorists, and some of them are enabling the Hamas terrorists. And what they have done is unspeakably brutal.
And so when you hear reports as that one from a hostage who said she was held by Gazan families in Gaza as a hostage, and then we've got our government bringing almost 1,000 Palestinian refugees into Australia with very quick security checks. And of course, not all Palestinians support Hamas, but a lot do. They have overwhelming support. Polls have proved that. It makes you wonder why the Australian government, and with the terror warnings that we've just been talking about, would make such a move.
James, I think we're at risk of thinking Australia is such a safe place. What happens in the Middle East has no implications for us here in Australia. It has real implications. We have large ethnic populations from all of those countries. So Lebanon, the Lebanese ethnic community in Australia is a very valuable part of our community, but some of the people are connected to very nasty, dangerous people in groups like Hezbollah. We have to be very clear-eyed about this, and the communities themselves are, but we also have to enforce our law to have our population understand that we're keeping Australia as a safe place. And unfortunately, we've got to be much more clear-eyed about the security side of things than the government has shown it's willing to be to date.
Yeah, well, I'd love to have a clear-eyed government. That'd be a wonderful thing. Michael, thank you for your time.